السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. باسم المركز الوطني للتعليم الإلكتروني نرحب بكل من انضم معنا في هذه الورشة بعنوان تصميم التعلم المصغر، وأسعد أنا زيد بن علي الرقيب بتقديمها، والتي تأتي ضمن البرنامج المؤتمر الدولي التعليم والتدريب الإلكتروني لتنمية القدرات البشرية، الذي ينظمه المركز خلال الفترة بين 24 وحتى 27 من الشهر الحالي. في حال لديكم أسئلة يمكنكم وضعها في الدردشة سواء باللغة العربية أو الإنجليزية، وسيتم الرد على أسئلتكم في نهاية الورشة. وننوه بضرورة تعبئة الاستبانة في نهاية الورشة للحصول على شهادة الحضور. ونود إشعاركم بإتاحة الترجمة الفورية باللغة العربية لهذه الورشة. الرجاء الضغط على أيقونة الترجمة Interpretation في أسفل الشاشة الآن. Good afternoon. On behalf of the National eLearning Center and the International Conference, eLearning for Human Capability Development, we welcome you all to this workshop on designing for micro-learning. I would like to introduce myself. My name is Zaid Rgeb, the moderator for this session. Today's workshop will be conducted by our distinguished speaker, Dr. Alan Bruce, CEO and Director of Universal Learning Systems, an international consultancy firm specializing in research, learning innovation and project management. ULS operates in the educational development and management sectors. It has offices in Ireland, Barcelona, Helsinki, Sao Paulo, and Chicago. Dr. Bruce is a sociologist who studied in Los Angeles, Galway, and Amsterdam. He has lectured in universities in France, England, the US, and Ireland, and worked in policy research for the European Commission in Brussels. In Ireland, he was responsible at national level for the training and accreditation of specialists working in vocational rehabilitation in the disability sector. He has lectured and published widely on the social construction of disability, labor market policy, equality paradigms, social inclusion, strategic change, and managing diversity. Dear participants, should you have any questions, you may post it in the chat either in English or Arabic, and we will answer them towards the end of the session. A link to the workshop survey has been provided in the chat. We kindly ask you to complete it within 10 minutes after the end of the session to receive a certificate of attendance. Without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Dr. Bruce.
Thank you very much, Sayed, and thank you for the words of introduction. I am delighted to be with all of you here today to explore one of the many exciting aspects of digital learning and digitally enhanced learning. What I would hope to cover with you today is more than simply a technical presentation on micromodularity. While important, it is part of a much wider structure, a much wider system that I would like to cover in some detail with you during this workshop, so that we can begin to look at the themes and the issues that inform how we structure digital learning at this exciting time. As you know, there are many things coming together in the world of learning at the moment. We have just emerged, or maybe we have not emerged, from the experience of the COVID pandemic. And this has had quite a shocking impact on world health systems and on recovery. It also has had a profound impact on education. And it has reasserted the sense of the importance of digital learning, of e-learning, of distance learning, and what we can do when we come down to actually making a difference for the people who are on our side. I'm sorry, Said, I'm just trying to get my presentation up here and make sure that I have it. Sorry. No. I hope you can all see this correctly. So what I would like to do in looking at the design of microlearning is to look at the design of learning. And what does this mean, given the times we're living through? There are a couple of themes I want to address. As you would have heard in the introduction, my background is a varied one. I have started life as a sociologist and social anthropologist and have lectured and taught on this widely, but I was drawn over time into government policy initiatives in relation to disability and rehabilitation. And to me at the time, it was a surprise because people would regard issues around disability as issues which are the purvey of maybe medical or psychological fields. But I found it was also hugely in the purvey of education, and inclusion in a wider sense is at the core of what the educational enterprise is about. So from that, I have moved over the last number of years into direct working with a number of levels with advanced and innovative learning systems, trying to look at these globally, trying to look at the technology as the servant of a much wider sense of why we educate as well as how we educate. I'm also speaking to you very clearly as from a European perspective. I work with the Commission now as an external expert in the evaluation of programs. I have been centrally involved in some of the working groups established by the Commission to look at digital learning, and I want to reflect that to you in the comments throughout this workshop. We are shaped in Europe at the moment by the recent publication of the Digital Education Action Plan. This will cover from 2021 to 2027, these 7 years, and this gives us a sense of a European perspective on what digital learning is about and how it can be applied. So within all that, this exciting time of development and change, I'm going to focus on 4 themes, which I hope will resonate throughout our presentation this afternoon. The first thing would be the question of global learning imperatives. We can no longer, in my opinion, regard learning as the purvey of one particular country. While national governments have responsibility for the education of their citizens, learning has become much wider. It is something which has no borders, and we need to be able to look at that because it affects all of us profoundly and intimately. The second thing is that one of the key issues when we talk about learning design is innovation. How do we do things in a new and fresh way? How do we absorb that innovation in ways which are not gimmicky or flimsy, but really go to the heart of human needs? Because designing for something which is new and creative means understanding the past, understanding the issues that have shaped this. The third theme is that whether we are talking at national or transnational level, we are talking about rapidly changing educational systems. The educational system for most of our countries was shaped in a certain way and at a certain time. If I could, each country has its own history on this, but I think it's quite interesting to look at the history of my own country, Ireland, and to look at a system which was largely imposed by an external colonial power, was a system based on strictness and on discipline and on memorization, and where the benefits of any were confined to a very small proportion of the population. As education broadens out, it raises issues around access, issues around openness, issues around accessibility for those who were traditionally excluded. And I would suggest you, connecting with the second point, that in our changing educational systems, one of the key drivers has been this question of inclusion. Inclusive education, by its nature, is itself highly innovative. It forces us to think in new ways about what learning is about and the utility and the purpose of learning. And I think that is something which is core to the work I am doing, because as education systems change, there's quite a significant resistance for many people who begin to feel that what do we do without examinations? What do we do without the structures that we have come to rely on? As I pointed out in the beginning, one of our offices is in Helsinki, and we work very closely with Finnish educational developments. And one of the amazing things over the years is watching how Finland has changed its educational system into something which is robust and creative and flexible. And this year did something for many countries which is quite revolutionary, because it abolished subjects. There are now learning themes with learning objectives. and formal demarcation of subjects is seen as something from the past. Subject content and material is certainly in there, but it's done in a new and flexible way, meeting the needs of today's students. For many countries, including my own, this is maybe a bridge too far, but it is again an example of the kinds of change that are occurring all around us. And the fourth theme I want to obviously bring us back to is the question of how do we take one aspect of digital learning, which is micro-learning, and how do we apply it? And in this context, I am going to be talking about the area which is closest to my own experience and my expertise in working particularly with the European Commission. And that is the issue of employment and work-based learning. Over the years, the issue of employee training and of capacity building in the workforce has been integrated very closely into digital learning systems. And the work on employment-based training has been somewhat taken second priority to the work with educational systems and schooling systems. But I think it's in the area of work and employment that these imperatives become most obvious and most evident in terms of what we need. It's in this area, by the way, that microlearning was first designed and experimented with. For busy people who need to upskill, they don't have time to do full courses. It might have been expected in the past. They need to do short elements. They need to have those elements linked, and they need consistently to bring those elements of training back to what they do and why they do it. And this forces a dialogue, an innovative dialogue between employer and employee, between state policy, between national economic policy, so that work-based learning is not a poor second relation, but driving digitalization in terms of innovation and creativity. So those are the four themes which I hope will kind of inform what we talk about and discuss this afternoon. So what do I hope to do with this? Well, I hope to locate digital learning themes in enterprises. That'd be my primary focus, although I think this obviously spills over into schools and into formal academic contexts. In the context of the value of learning, why is learning important? What value do we put to it? Until we ask those questions, micromodularity doesn't make sense. It is simply one tool floating in the air without a real connection to social and personal learning needs. We need to examine, and I hope to do that in this workshop, enterprise-specific environments. What exactly is happening in these areas? And in terms of the challenges and demands, including the value that owner-managers place on the organization and provision of staff training. I think this is a critical aspect because employers, no more than anybody else, are dealing with huge elements of change in the system, huge elements of uncertainty, and of course, the imperatives of globalization. But what is the importance of training? And in Ireland, as in many European countries, training is traditionally at the bottom of the priority list. When cuts come, and we saw this, for example, during the COVID pandemic crisis at the very beginning, the first thing many companies cut as a luxury is training. But as many of my colleagues have pointed out time and time again, it is precisely at a moment of crisis and change that we need more training, not less. And the digitalization of that training therefore becomes an imperative for companies to look at new and creative ways to upskill, to adapt, to change, and to know why that is happening. This is core for the success and survival even of the enterprises we have. A final element, a third element I'd like to talk about is how do we improve our understanding of corporate digital learning programs? What value do they create for enterprises? Everybody will know the mantra about return on investment, but how do we show to enterprises, large and small, and some of the most interesting work is taking place in small ones, that digital learning makes a difference, not simply in increasing the bottom line in terms of profitability, although that happens, but in terms of motivation, adaptability, commitment of the worker, the sense that they are making progress and making progress with the company. And I think in this, we have the seeds for real transformation over the next couple of decades. It is already happening, but the difference with learning is that we shape that happening and make it real for the participants involved. And the final point, of course, is the question of microlearning itself. How does it contribute to learning design? We have had a lot of experience, and I will be giving you case studies for us to look at and explore in the workshop, where we have used microlearning extensively. And at times it has been highly useful, but how do we put those blocks together? Microlearning itself is quite clear. We have short, attractive modules that teach one, possibly two skills. We try to focus on the usability, the reference, but unless there is a framework, a structured framework of wider learning design, our efforts may be misguided. We need to bring this back, therefore, into a full understanding of what we're doing, why we're doing, and we need to communicate this to all stakeholders. This is a critical aspect of what we do in designing learning, both at macro and at micro level. So let's look at some of those themes in practical terms. The first thing, if we have the scope and overview that I would like to cover in the workshop clear in your minds, these are some of the background issues that to me are important when we talk about the changes we are facing in real time in all our societies. The first thing is the change and diversification of modern society. Now, again, excuse me if I'm speaking largely, not exclusively, from a European perspective, but what this means is that at a number of levels, we have challenges in terms of the workforce, in terms of attracting new skilled workers. We have variations in national experiences, but throughout Europe, we have a couple of recurring themes. One is the question of aging. In Northern Europe, this is particularly important. Not enough children are being born. Those who are working are getting older. There are issues about being able to adapt. There are the questions of integration of older workers and indeed of younger workers, and indeed in schools as well. When we talk about lifelong learning, it is about everybody. Second issue we have is the one of inclusion. People with disabilities, traditionally excluded groups, minorities. Third is the role of women, the participation of women in the workforce and indeed in education. The fourth one, which is dominant in many parts of Europe, is the question of migration, of people coming in, and sometimes of people leaving, as flight from the land and rural depopulation continues. All these are critical issues in change. And the educational system and the learning system for enterprise cannot stay neutral. It cannot stay apart from this. It is part of the solution, otherwise it is part of the problem. The second key issue is that traditional jobs are simply disappearing, or they are changing beyond recognition. And that question of happening in real time for many workers is deeply unsettling. There was a time, certainly in my parents' generation, where the expectation was that you would go through your education, you would receive your certificates, and you would go into a job, a permanent job, secure for the rest of your life, and you would retire quite happily at 65. Now we find that is gone. The security element has been replaced by a question of jobs which can last, where people are being asked or asked themselves to work until they're 70, 75 or later, where the nature of the job has changed and where we need to have learning on the job. And this produces many exciting challenges for learning designers. We have wider skill requirements, particularly in operational tasks. This is something which I witnessed in my own career. At the beginning, it was sufficient to have a job description and to design the training to enable the worker to do that job and to provide that training in the clear expectation that that training and that job would last for a significant period of time. Now, the job may change within months. The demands, the skills required may change within months. This is precisely where micro-modularity has an advantage. We can design things to enable people to cope with change, to update knowledge and skills, to provide people with new and fresh perspectives on what they are doing and why they're doing it. And we can update these and connect these with other micro modules. This is of critical importance because the requirements change, not just doing a job a certain way, but doing it in new ways. We have shorter parallel careers. If we do not have that job until 65, we have people working at a certain level for a certain period of time and then changing, doing new jobs, developing a portfolio of qualifications, a digital one at that, which they will take with them, and showing that the variety of their career and their exposure is in fact what more and more employers want. This indicates flexibility and adaptability and the ability to learn. Alvin Toffler wrote a very famous book many years ago about future shock, has recently come out again saying that the future will be a question of learning, unlearning, and relearning again. And while this may seem very unsettling, particularly for traditional educationalists, to me, it opens an exciting possibility of new and innovative learning design paradigms. Another key point in the background to this is the employers, and we work extensively with employers throughout Europe and indeed the United States, are struggling, really struggling to find suitable employees. People will present themselves with paper qualifications or with high academic qualifications, which is wonderful. But can they do the job? Can they learn on the job? And this has become a critical factor for employers ranging from Google to Microsoft to Intel right across. If I can just tell you one quick example, we did a major initiative with Intel, which has a very, very large facility employing some 9,000 people outside Dublin in Ireland. And we are looking what was senior management looking for in terms of the people they recruited, expecting that they would say, for example, they wanted digital learning specialists, computer engineers, software design engineers. But their first requirement, the first requirement of recruiting was people with a background in philosophy. I was quite shocked. I said, philosophy, why? Because they wanted people who knew how to think. And people who could do that, that is what you do when you're doing systems design and analysis. You are thinking. So we may find in different ways that employers are not looking for a traditional stereotypical set of skills, but looking for that evidence that people can think creatively, think outside the box. And if they think differently, they will design differently and be able to cope with the pace of change. That's from an employer point of view. From an employee point of view, there's this need to seek new opportunities. If life is going to be different and changing and more flexible, what is in it for the individual worker or for the individual student? How can they gather the experience that they need to do things? And in this sense, the design of modules that help increase people's proficiency and skills, give them a reflection of that, is a key element in innovative learning design with which we have worked. And we have a final element that's come up, and it's coming up in some of the literature around part-time entrepreneurs. People are not just working for others, but thinking of working for themselves, or indeed their community. So the kinds of work they do, the kinds of risks they take in structuring a new world becomes intimately connected, not with a static system of progression and learning, but with something which is much more dynamic. It's about personal growth, community growth, organizational growth. And where that growth is recorded, and digital technologies give us an extraordinary resource for that, it can be reflected and seen, not simply as a form of certification or examination, but going much more into capacity development, creativity, and creation. We are asking a lot of people because the world we live in needs a lot. And what we're asking for is people to have that sense of dynamism and creativity so that if they have a new idea, they can bring it to a forum and check it out. And micro-modularity fits into that, enabling people to update, to refresh, to see their lifelong learning not as something confined to 9 to 5, but throughout their waking hours, throughout their private life, and bringing in a much wider network in terms of sustainable and creative learning, which is what, to me, digitalization is all about. There are specific issues facing employers, and in this I am reflecting work we did, which was published last year for the European Commission on the role of digital learning within enterprises. We are concentrating a lot in Europe about schools and the schools' need for digital resources, but we have not concentrated as much on what employers need. And what the employers have been saying to us is a very, very clear message. The first thing is that they have a very high turnover. You will probably be aware in the United States at the moment that there is a huge amount of public focus, concentration, and alarm at what has been called the resignation culture, the resignation tsunami, partly occasioned by the impact of the COVID pandemic. People now, as they recover or partially recover, are simply leaving their jobs. People are not happy with the way things are. So what they do is they quit. The impact on employers, and this was happening already, but it is accelerated to an extraordinary extent, the impact on employers is quite high. What happens when people leave? People don't want to stay. You cannot recruit. How are we going to go about making the environment more attractive? Turning it from simply a production center, but into a learning center where there are benefits for all. One of the issues, therefore, that we looked at was micro-modularity in doing something critically important in identifying, assessing, selecting, and engaging new employees. Traditional recruitment systems are simply cumbersome. They don't always produce good results. They are very expensive. They don't give us what they say they are going to do. Micro-modules, on the other hand, applied in a learning program for people applying to work, had a stunningly positive impact. People were able to learn practical things about themselves and be able to present themselves well. And I want to give some statistics about that later. The study we did on this was quite revealing and quite important. And one of the things I looked at was, how do we manage high volumes of work? Candidates. How do we have people we're expecting to do a lot, and how do we actually manage them? And it cannot be done by control. It has to be done by internal motivation. How do we ensure that people we do select actually have the required skills? As I said earlier, they may have presented with a long dossier of qualifications and of certification, but do they actually have the skills? And how can we assess that in advance rather than wasting our time and theirs? How do we ensure that only informed candidates are selected? And this is a challenge for many companies, particularly for big ones. We've worked quite closely with Google in Ireland, and their selection process is, to put it mildly, quite innovative, because they know they're not going to get the kind of people they need from asking traditional questions and interviews, but by performing tasks and doing things and seeing those who are different and who can take risks. That is the kind of people they want. So they provide the kind of training for those applying for jobs that will produce that kind of person. And among that will be micro-modules that talk about their skills, about their profile, about their capacities. I think this is a very exciting way to go in terms of our understanding the role and impact of digital learning in meeting the challenges faced by employers. In that employment sector, you can see in this short graph, it covers from 1970 over, well, really we're talking the last 50 years, some of the digital learning phases that came into play over that period of time. Back in the 1970s, for example, at that period of time, we had computer-based training, pioneers, people doing this for the first time, quite innovative and very often structuring the computer-based or digital learning to traditional conceptions of learning and out of replication of learning. Around 2000, we had the LMS hype, as my colleague Demo Butler calls it, when people are coming in learning management systems, designing this, and again, trying to fit that to the environment. Big budget experiments coming up. And then, to me, the most important thing for the Western world, at least, was the financial crisis from 2008 on. There we saw the fragility of many social and economic systems, We saw issues around indebtedness, around even national collapse. This had a particularly strong effect, for example, in some European countries, and particularly in Ireland, in Greece, in Spain, and in Portugal, and to a great extent in Italy. And this caused a complete rethink of what we were doing. Certainly in Finland as well, although not as gravely affected by the economic crisis, financial crisis, Finland was able to restructure its educational and training system quite rapidly from about 2010 on. The acceleration since then of technologies and applications can be seen in the graph. We have seen not just going from business as usual and an awakening, going back to the best of the past with digital tools, but moving into conceptual diversification, doing things in really innovative ways, and finally looking at the real motor of this, in the corporate sector in Europe at least, would be small to medium enterprises. These are the ones which provide us with rich experimental areas to explore everything from micro-modularity to advanced digital learning. We can see that some of the examples here I want to talk about was that in the 1970s in the aviation sector, we had computer-based training. Today, however, we can see a major change in large corporate enterprises. The preferred way of running training is digital and self-directed learning. We leave this up to the individual to do. And that means that the ability to design and to apply learning in innovative ways for enhanced performance and sustainable operation is the critical one for big companies. Let me unpack that a little bit more with you. I think the workplace is important because that is where we forge the future. This is where relationships based on productivity, on change, and on personal development are really created. And within that, we need to have strong, vigorous, and dynamic learning programs and training programs. And what are these companies looking for? They want enhanced performance, yes, and they want an operation which is sustainable and creative. But that means that all staff, at whatever level, must be able to design and apply learning in innovative ways. And that means from very basic levels up. This is where micro-modularity comes in as a key tool in being able to look at digital learning in the workplace. In SMEs, why are they important for us? Well, one of the reasons they're important is that's where most people in Europe today work. Small enterprises which are nimble, flexible, quick, doing things in new ways, facing market demands full on in a very, very challenging way. And there's some research behind that to begin to look at this. We mentioned this is coming from the report we did with the European Commission, but we know that training in SMEs is under-researched, yet it is in those SMEs that we can find some examples of best practice and creativity in applying digital learning frameworks. Nolan and Garavan in 2011 talked about the gap that studies did not address employees' perceptions. And we need to look at that because that is really the key area where innovation is being forged. In 2008, Johnson and Devons had talked about existing research not taking account of the informal, flexible nature of much workforce development in small organizations. Let's go back to that. We look at in a small company which has to survive, has to create, has to produce, has to follow up. And the nature of that work is largely informal and flexible. But rather than seeing that as a deviation from the norm, we see this as a marker of the future. And our good digital learning will follow that. Informality, flexibility, adaptability in producing tools which are rich, which are relevant, and produce sustained benefit for all stakeholders. What is thrown up here, and this is not the place in this workshop, is a lack of a really rigorous theory which can help us to look at the development and implementation of successful digital learning programs in SMEs. However, the report we did was a first step and was a very important first step in outlining the key issues, some of which I will be reflecting in the themes I'm sharing with you in this workshop. So let's look at some of these things within SMEs. But we know that very often our SMEs are struggling with digital learning. They find this maybe too complex or too difficult or too burdensome, or they lack the technical skills, okay? And however, this can be addressed, and it has been addressed, not by many people or many agencies, but it can be done in creative ways. And the findings of that, the research I would suggest to you, is quite rich in terms of deciding what you can take out from learning design, and particularly the digitalization that suits your circumstances the best. The Change Learning Alliance, of which I'm a founding partner, works in Finland and Ireland. And from our research and publications, we found that there were very often real issues for implementation of digital learning in enterprises because of financial issues. In other words, this has resource implications. The second thing was that practical implementation arrangements to run digital courses are challenging. How do we reach people in their place of work, particularly if it is small or informal? This can be overcome, and there are many examples how this was done. And one of the elements used in that by ourselves was the question of micro modules, which could fit into people's work, which would be attractive and above all, memorable. And that took some years of design to do that. There were many technical issues around that, many areas of resistance. But what is that? Maybe people should be doing a longer course. They are doing a longer course, but it is broken up in different segments. But to break something up is not a solution. The solution is to understand why it is broken up and how we can relate that back to an overall picture and design that we need. Okay, digital learning, therefore, we were able to demonstrate had strategic value for SMEs. And this is something we were able to illustrate quite strongly and quite forcefully for our client organizations and for policymakers at European level. First thing is that what we had found came through was that the economic potential of digital learning had not yet been realized fully for smaller companies. It was out there, but connecting the two together is sometimes a much more difficult task. There were great legacies of digital learning for large corporations, but very often their focus had been on profit maximization and growth, which maybe was somewhat alien to the core business of SMEs. For SMEs, digital learning is cost effective. That's the first thing. Certainly compared to face-to-face learning and training, or even traditional e-learning. Sorry, I should say blended learning. But SMEs still need economic assistance to use the scaled benefits of digital learning. So this is a question of empowering people, being able them to see at small enterprise level how they can do something and do it effectively and well. One of the issues is that the strategic value of learning is often not grasped. And I think this is important. And this is because of the lack of an overall planning policy. Time after time, we have talked to client companies and organizations. What do you want to achieve? What is your overall goal? And our experience repeatedly is that if you do not have that goal, if there is not a vision about what the company or the enterprise wants to achieve and how to do it, that no technology, no micromodularity, no digital system will fill the gap. It simply becomes a tool working without a purpose. So time after time, it is to engage stakeholders in a structured planning process of what learning is about. What do your staff need to know? What do the staff feel that they need to know? And how does that come back to how the business operates? And this calls for new levels and new dimensions of dialogue and discussion internally and indeed externally. Yes, the technology can do wonders, but only if you know what you are doing with it. So the added value, the real added value of micromodularity and of digitally supported learning in the workplace lies in the autonomy of the employee. And time after time, I slip between saying the employee and the learner, because in fact, they are the same thing. The learner is also an employee. The employee is a learner, but the autonomy at times can seem risky. It can seem risky for the employer. But it's critical that the person feels that autonomy and feels that growth so that they can derive maximum benefit from the technology they're using. The second part of added value is the social immediacy of learning. I am learning now. I'm not going away to some other space to learn and then come back, although from time to time that's important. But the social immediacy is, as I'm doing something on that place, I can pull down the module or the issue that I need to learn how to do it. We do a lot of advanced training in the airport services and airline industry. And this is something which I have learned a huge amount about, because in this we are talking a wide range of skills and capacities, ranging from the primary issue, which is health and safety for travelers in airports, but right across to customer service, dealing with complaints, dealing with schedules, dealing with travel requirements. And we have seen this severely tested over the last two years. But we found that people on the front line need to update their training in terms of the systems they're using, the challenges they're dealing with. And there was nothing better to do this than micromodules. When somebody found a specific problem, they were able to access a module which for them was able to explain, clear the issue, give them the particular skill to do that, and move on. Recording that and embedding that in their overall development is another issue, but this is where digital training helps in real time, problem solving. And this, I think, is the nature of the best digital learning. How do we solve problems, and why did we solve them that way? And finally, this all helps SMEs and the other employers to see the potential of digital learning links and how digital learning and how that links and their links directly to the need for the strategic vision I talked about a few minutes ago. Now, some issues and themes come up here that it would be worth recording, and they're again reflected in the literature which is available. And I do hope later, if you do have any questions about this, I can refer you to literature sources. But we do know that corporate learning itself, as a broad field, has gone through many changes, apart from the technology. We know that the knowledge-based economy we have moved into creates many new demands for learning. It changes the role and purpose of learning in the corporate sector. To sum up, in the past, training programs given to employees help them to develop and maintain skills and competence relevant to their work role and business objectives. And that's a nice way to sum it up. That's what went on. But today, various learning forms enable companies to acquire talent, to motivate and engage employees to excel, encourage them to share their expertise, and learn how to improve organizational performance. In other words, we've moved from task-specific performance to organization-specific enhanced output. And this calls for a whole set of new skills in terms of communication and dynamism and learning and reflecting on that learning and reflecting it back to other workers and people that we understand. Training and development opportunities are highly valued by employees. This we know, and all the literature reflects that. When employees feel that their organization, large or small, is investing in their capacity development, their expertise development, they respond positively and indeed enthusiastically. And where's the proof of this? Ongoing training and development opportunities keep retention rates high. They increase employee engagement. And this, to me, if nothing else, is the critical proof of why we need a strategy and why the technologies we adopt will enable that strategy to achieve something really significant. At a time of shedding employees, at a time of resignations, if we have an enterprise which is able to keep people there because they want to be there, and in fact increase their development, we've achieved a remarkable goal. If I can give you one example, if that's okay with you, over a number of years, we had experience of working with the largest private company in Ireland called Waterford Crystal. Waterford Crystal at the time had some of the highest brand recognition in the world, certainly in the United States, where it produced cut glass crystal. And it was up there in the United States in terms of brand recognition with Rolls-Royce or with Cartier. It was very high. They owned Wedgwood in Britain and they owned Rosenthal in Germany, and they employed several thousand workers in the southeast of Ireland. But the company had had a shock and had to let people go during one of the first economic crises of the 1990s. And the solution afterwards was, how can we bring in learning? Because while our staff were recruited at the age of 15 and knew how to cut beautiful crystal glass, they knew nothing else. And while they were expert in that area, they didn't have the other skills that a modern enterprise needed. So when we came in, we designed a learning center in cooperation with the company's senior executives and with the trade unions and with the workers and indeed customers. And that learning center was open to any course that anybody wanted to do. And we found immediately a huge change in terms of retention. People who had left or gone out on sick leave wanted to stay. They began learning new things, not simply engineering courses, but some were doing other courses on social sciences, on marketing. We found it was very useful to take workers and to send them to the United States to actually sell the products they were making. In other words, a whole virtuous circle of creativity and performance and production began to increase. And that learning center became the first dedicated learning center in an Irish company, and was also the first one to pioneer some of the technologies we are talking about today. And we found people who had sometimes very basic levels of formal academic skills being able to upskill, to learn new things, to be able to move into a much more creative and dynamic framework. And the impact on the company was dramatic in terms of people staying, but also the engagement that people had in what they did. Now, if this is possible, and if digital learning enables us to bring a new kind of learning in, why is it that we still have difficulties and challenges? Is it just the technology? If we adjust that technology, will all these problems go away? Or do we have something else? Well, we can see that some of the literature talks about facts which are quite disturbing. Learning designers failing their profession, according to Memon and Stein. Okay, 90% of all training programs fail. This is quite disturbing. People bring in training programs and they don't work. They work for a time. They're not sustainable. When people, and I'm talking about traditional learning programs on the job. Phillips and Phillips in 2002, now this is 20 years ago, but at that stage, they found that what was learned, and this does reflect the technologies at the time, 60 to 90% of that was not applied on the job. So there was a disconnect between what people were learning or studying and what they were able to do in their job space. They didn't see the connection, so it simply didn't happen. Quite obviously, therefore, why a human resource department would say, what's the point of doing all this training if it doesn't make a difference for people? But one of the conclusions that came through was that academic models of learning design were not appropriate. Not that they were wrong, but they were academic. They were designed for a different structure and a different system in a different place and at a different time. And we cannot simply splice technology onto an academic model and hope it'll work or be surprised when it doesn't. What therefore is needed is an approach to ensure success, which we call learning design for impact. We work back from what we want to achieve at a whole series of levels, and we begin to forge our learning design around that to make a truly creative contribution to the learning culture of an organization. And I would suggest, being bold, of any organization, large or small enterprise, public learning bodies, continuing education centers, whatever we want. Successful programs as a contrast to the other rather negative findings, successful programs make a huge impact. If they're well targeted, this learning boosts productivity, retains talent, and the gains are often exponential. In the work we've been doing in airport services training, we've seen a dramatic uptake in terms of commitment and engagement of people who are able to access training which is relevant to their needs, relevant to their circumstances, and provides them with the skills to provide solutions in real time. And much of this training we structure through micro-modules. So here is a schema I want to leave with you for the moment, and we can perhaps have some discussion around this. This learning design for impact has been designed in Finland in 2018 by my colleagues Teemu Paatela and Christian Martinen. And this talks about, you'll see the key elements on the left: returns on learning investment not realized if the learning fails to address established objectives. That's the first general thing. A pedagogical fit for purpose is critical. This shifts the burden of work, therefore, from simply designing a learning program into designing a learning framework within which that program takes place. And this calls for a lot of flexibility and skills. And if we look at the chart here, we'll talk about the things that go into that, the kind of learning intervention. Level 1 would be notification and reading, the basic information someone needs. Level 2, moving up, multimedia-based content. Okay, rich, exciting, and creative. Number 3, engaging action learning content, problem solving, games, things that really begin to draw out lessons and leads into level 4, interactive, active, rich, media-based learning content. And finally, advanced interactive methods, okay, that enable this learning to cascade across a whole series of different levels. And as that learning intervention increases to those 5 levels, look at the desired learning outcome on the right. So from the beginning, from level 1, we can talk about remembering. We want people to remember basic information. By level 2, we are seeking for people to understand what is going on, to be able to absorb that and see the logic for themselves. Number 3, they are able to apply this to their work, apply this to the tasks they have to do or may have to do in future. By level 4, we are talking about frontline workers being able to analyze and indeed evaluate and reflect that back based on the modules they have been going through. This is where micro-modules are a great help, fitting into a whole network of basic skills where people can begin to see the pattern, draw out the learning from that. And the final stage, throughout all this, we see motivation increasing, is that people are actually able to create. And the employer or the organization is comfortable with people creating. It's not seen as threatening because it feeds into the warp and woof of industrial organization and of how people structure their working day. This particular learning design for impact paradigm is something which we have used in the design of the programs we have. I hope you would find it of use and being of some interest to the work you do, and certainly in terms of the sharing that we would like to be able to develop when we talk about micro-modules. So let me stop at this point to take a breath and to ask you a couple of questions. If what I have said so far makes sense to you and gives you a flavor of some of the things we've been doing, from your experience, what are the key? I just want you to maybe think of these questions and reflect. I'm also going to look, I see there are comments here, if you have questions for me, but I would like you at this stage to start thinking, what are the key learning needs from your experience of today's employees? From your experience, what are 3 key elements? And from your experience, how does digital learning improve performance? Now, not just knowledge and skills, but performance. So let me open the chat and questions and answers and see if I have any comments from you that I can deal with. Would anybody like to ask a question, or would anybody like to? I have some very, very interesting comments here on the question and answer side. Now, I'm just going through the comments as I see them, and I noticed that Lila has talked about computer skills are a must, and I would absolutely agree with you. I think a basic familiarity with that, I think, is a key requirement for everybody working in today's environment. I'm particularly interested by a series of comments from Richard Krent. And I take very much your point through. And I must say, first of all, I did say at the beginning, I was going to focus from my experience on the question of business and SMEs, because I think learning at work has been one of the most challenging areas for us in terms of looking at innovative e-learning interventions. But this is not in any sense to dismiss or to minimize the importance of education, traditional education. In fact, the two are intimately linked. And I think the points that Richard makes are extremely worthwhile in terms of trying to flesh that out into a much wider context.
We've received an interesting question.
I'm sorry, Zaid?
We've received a question that I'd like to read out to you.
Of course, yeah.
It says that people that think has always been the criteria for employment and human progress, innovation and creative development of products and things of value are all derived from thought. How is the education system addressing this?
Have all been derived from thought, did you say?
Yes.
And how is the education system addressing this? Well, my first response, this is a very, very good question, is what education system are we talking about? And I think that we have many, many examples throughout the world of education systems, some of which are based on very, very different identified needs. But I think it's not simply producing a product, it is really about learning to think. I think the kind of education systems that mean most to me are the educational systems that enable people to develop critical thinking facilities. That means exposure to not just ideas, but examples of good practice, of ethical practice. I think a critical reflection is required in all educational systems to enable people to analyze honestly and fairly, but also an educational system which approaches values and the worth of individuals in terms of being creative and productive human beings. I think traditionally our economic systems have been linear, have been producing product to maximize profit. I find this absolutely disastrous. But I think our educational systems need to go back more in schooling contexts and to enable our students to learn how to think critically, and to come up with ideas and insights, which are very important. At the moment, I'm involved in a wonderfully creative project in Palestine in terms of developing the first intervention center there. And what we found, if I switch immediately from talking about enterprises and large-scale SMEs, right across to dealing with people who are under 5 years old in a very, very difficult situation, what are we trying to do? Because what we also know is in these first 5 years of life, we have some of the most creative insights of our entire lives. And we have a gift given to us here in terms of freshness and insight. So learning is not simply pouring from one into another, but learning from different kinds and categories of people. And I think that's really important in terms of how creating richness, in terms of developing thought, in terms of getting good ideas, in terms of what our education system should be. One of the benefits, I think, of a renewed focus on lifelong learning is that at each stage of our lives, people learn and learn creatively. And it is good for us not to forget those and to decouple from a linear kind of progression into something which is much more creative and dynamic and interactive. I hope that answers the question, Zaid.
Great, thank you. You've touched on a topic in terms of failure in training programs. We've received a question that it says, what do you mean by failure of training programs? Is it because there is no sustainability of such programs? Please clarify this point.
Yeah, I think what we were talking about was when we talk about any training program succeeding or failing, we're talking about what did we expect it to do at the very beginning anyway. And I think that's important. And I think the reason they very often fail is that programs are linear or they're designed in such a way that they teach something assuming that the universe is static. And things are changing quite dramatically. So we find that learning programs which are based on real needs and meeting those needs and providing feedback for everybody concerned are much more beneficial. Now, many things come from that. The question, the role and the value and the benefit of any of certification, for example, of personal career progression. But in my experience, the big critical thing is training which enables people to do their job better, but to then begin to contribute and shape that job. I would go back to the points I made around autonomy and being able to creatively contribute to an overall process. So many things are happening at the same time. We need to move from individuals being just passive employees of a system who do what they're supposed to do, no more and no less. That's why so many people are leaving in the United States at the moment, into people who are valued, who are creative, who may themselves be the agents of change. Change will happen anyway. And I think one of the critical issues when I talked about learning and change was that there is the change which happens anyway and is imposed on us, or the change that companies begin or schools begin to anticipate and develop. I haven't talked about schools, but what's happening in school change, certainly in Europe, has been extremely rich and very, very interesting to watch. Not in a derivative sense, but in a really creative and dynamic way. And I think those are the kind of synergies between sectors which I think are going to be very important.
Great, thank you for that, Dr. Roos. It says microlearning is a method that helps fill the digital divide to raise the learning quality of graduates through microlearning lessons. How good is the quality of microlearning of education and training outcomes worldwide? And what is the extent of unifying it with the different languages or educational and professional levels of the trainee / learner?
Yeah, very, very good question. The first thing is that microlearning worldwide is a varied and complex kind of area. I would, that this has been taken on board in a number of ways. One of the reasons we have concentrated on the world of employment is that's where it's maybe more deployed at the moment and where we've seen results. In schools and in educational systems, certainly in Europe, it is not the norm, although in some places for teacher training it is. But generally speaking, it's not, could be applied, may be applied, but maybe that's for the next stages. The action plan on digital learning, I referred to at the very beginning of my presentation, talks about a couple of, this is at European level, a couple of key strategic goals. And the first one is a high performance forming digital education ecosystem. So the ecosystem is important. Microlearning has not come into that at all. The second overarching goal is enhancing digital skills and competencies for that digital transformation, and microlearning is covered there. In the world of enterprise, it has been there, and it's been good because it can be used, applied, reviewed, adapted, and people move on to other levels. And I think this is something which we've been able to track maybe with more rigor than we were able to do at the schools level. In schools levels, we are still dealing with ministries, and we're dealing with huge variations in school systems throughout Europe, ranging from the Finnish one I talked about earlier, which would be noted internationally as one of the most flexible and creative and non-dogmatic systems, down to systems like the Irish one, which is in transition, still heavily reliant on final examinations, and finally down to ones as in Greece or in Spain, which are largely based on memorization and facts. So we have a wide and wonderful picture there. Microlearning is maybe a bridge too far for those entities. Saeed.
Perfect. So we'll leave the rest of the questions and towards the end of the session.
That's good. We can do that. I just wanted to see some of the ones I'm going through, some of the ones now.
Sure.
There's a comment from Bushra Al-Khatani. Digital learning can measure performance to the level of satisfaction and understanding. Only after that, there should be an intense follow-up process with the entity to continue measuring the impact and result. I absolutely agree. And this is one of the priorities for us, was the idea of being able to see what real difference did that make, what impact. Otherwise, we're really wasting an awful lot of time. I'm not it's about wealth. Wealth of ideas and creativity, which is really important. And I think that's the area I'd like to concentrate on. Okay, if I can get my little cursor to do the right things for me, I shall, okay, close that now. And I want to go back, okay, to the, sorry, one moment. I'm just making sure I'm on. Yes. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide now. Sorry, I just want to make sure I was on the right one. All right, let's move on. I understand, Zaid, that we are going to have a much longer period for questions and answers towards the end. I propose to devote around 20-25 minutes to that. So maybe at that stage, we can flesh out some of these ideas and issues that I'm trying to reflect with you in this workshop. Okay, let's go back therefore to digital learning and to some of the aspects therefore we have from that. And some of these points may come up have already come up in terms of the questions you've addressed to us and in our discussion there. First thing we can say is that providing engaging learning programs, and I need to stress that, a learning program, however digital, is not enough unless it's engaging. It brings people in. We do know that it significantly improves employee engagement and retention. We've mentioned this before, but these are the facts we know, and these are the ones reflected at our own European Commission level in terms of its new digital learning policy. Contextual learning experience significantly improves learning in workplace context. So the context is important, understanding that. And the context at the moment includes a lot of disruption and change and flexibility. We know that mobile learning is 45% more time efficient than other forms of learning. Again, some of you in your questions, I was able to notice we're asking for particular resources and sources in this, and I'll be quite happy to provide that after the workshop if people contact me, or doing it through the NELC good offices. We know that with the key work been done by Westphal and Hogel in the last number of years, micro-modularity can increase learner engagement up to 50%. This is significant. So we have the first dimension, which you'll see on the side, which is contextual. What is the context I'm working in? This means 360-degree vision around what we're doing. And this is a priority for enterprises, small, medium, or large. And it should be a priority for schools, as schools begin to rethink the needs of the 21st century of pupils students and indeed teachers alike. The second thing, though, is the micromodular tool, which is something which can increase learner engagement, is extremely significant. And why is this engagement important? Because engaged employees are more productive. Okay, so from an employer point of view, they're more productive, they increase the bottom line. That's fine. But productivity is also about the human satisfaction of doing a job well. They're more engaged. They carry this with them. They're able to integrate this with their lives. Turnover decrease, evidence through some of this research, of up to 87%. Okay, decrease in turnover that size is highly significant. Okay, costs of low engagement, you can see salary costs, and replacing employees, replacing one employee can be 50 to 250% of the annual salary. So simply reducing turnover is good. But this is not done by diktat or by forcing people, but by making the job attractive, making it, if I dare be so bold, into a creative learning environment itself. Remember those three key words: contextual, micromodular, and mobile. So how can we do this? What are the particular things that have been used? And this is again coming from our work and our research and some of the issues we are still working with. We support operational excellence, and this means consultancy with companies and indeed with schools and other learning entities. We implement cost-efficient ways to develop learning programs. Many learning programs are provided by many learning providers. Some of these can be very costly. For decision makers who may not know the content or may lack an overall idea of what they want, they can spend a lot of money or put in a lot of resources and not get back what they wanted initially. So this becomes a process of learning and research and dialogue and discussion. If we're talking in the school sector, this is something which can, with value, be done by ministries of education or educational authorities, but very often isn't, because this kind of innovative research has not been prioritized. In Spain, for example, there's a highly centralized system which must be approved at each point, and this would not be fully possible, whereas in a country like Finland or the Netherlands, a more flexible approach to why the teaching is being done that way will be discussed. Second point, we must ensure high quality learning experiences that are fit for purpose. And this issue, I'm throwing in the word of quality, becomes critical in what we want. How do we ensure quality? Not simply value for money, but something which reaches real needs, human needs, learning needs, personal needs, career needs, and it's fit for purpose. Good micromodules, for example, resonate well with staff because they're relevant. They speak to the world they know, they understand. Problem solving is done in real time, and this can be integrated in creative and rich ways. Another element, in which is sometimes quite a challenge for many learners and many organizations, is the idea of allowing learning to take place 24/7, every day, independent of location. Now, this idea of mobility is very attractive. And if I'm honest with you, there are two sides to this. I love the idea of learning being able to be flexible, of people study in their own time. I'm also very wary of environments, and I have seen them, where this is a form of control, of your employer being able to phone you at 4 a.m. to see what you're doing, a way of checking that people are still doing things. This checking mentality, this supervisory methodology is profoundly destructive for everybody concerned. But the idea of mobile learning, the idea of a person being motivated enough to say, I have spare time, I'd like to do some of that training. I'd like to follow up on this issue or problem that was worrying me. It's very creative and very fresh and a good thing to do. Part of my problem in the past, some of you may have seen from my bio, I spent 17 years working with an Irish government organization, and our job was about policy. I was National Director for Development and Standards. And what this meant was going into schools and going into agencies, working with disability, looking at quality and looking at standards, but also looking at staff performance and ensuring that the education and the training that was provided to staff who would be working with very vulnerable populations was of the highest possible level. And this included teachers and social workers and care workers and therapists. But one of the great difficulties was the resistance of people to go beyond their demarcated job. I work these hours. Beyond that, I don't. Now, there's a time for everybody to tune off. But the people who stood out were the people who are willing to go that extra bit, who were able to reflect on issues. And sometimes these were critical life and death issues in their free time and bring it back so that it wasn't a static work environment, but a creative part of a learning community. And that's where mobility comes into me. And this is where the technology has been transformative. We can learn and we can communicate instantaneously. One of the things as well is bringing a form of, let's use the old word, automation into the learning process and administration. The technology goes both ways. We can administer things cost effectively and quickly. We can see that the learning process, for example, is automated. We know how many modules the person is accessing. We know if there are gaps or if they want to go into this. We simplify administrative procedures to make this workable for everybody concerned. Another thing, and this sounds strange, but we want to reduce the time spent on those formal learning modules. Micro modules are great for focusing the mind within a 3 or 5 minute slot. Now, obviously, much learning. We are learning all the time. We are learning as we sit here, as we think, as we do things. But what's important is that people are not taking time off just to learn. As indeed students in schools don't just take time off to learn. They're learning all the time. They're learning when they play. They're learning when they communicate. They're learning when they eat. They are learning when they ask questions. They are learning when they get answers. They are learning when they memorize. In other words, we reduce the time spent on formal learning and replace that with continuous time spent on learning adaptability and creativity. We need to provide incentives for employees to complete programs. While I am into the process, and to me it's critically important, and the idea of the added value from creativity and indeed challenge, I think it is also important that people see real and tangible acknowledgement for what they have done. And traditionally this was denied or was made extremely elitist. It was for the few. But in recent times, all of you, I believe, following this workshop will be able to receive a certificate. I think it's very important that we have these records of attainment. It fits into our portfolio, that there are rewards in terms of what we do. So there's a tangible payback without being too behaviorist here. And then the other thing is with badges. And there's been a revolution, as we all know, digital learning with the open badge movement. One of my colleagues, Serge Ravet, is perhaps the European guru on this, has run many projects, but we now have digital portfolios. We have people who at an instant are able to show us their attainments, the skills they have covered. And this is the other side of the coin of the micro modules. We have the relevant learning, but we also have the recognition that over a period of time, people have done this. This is a powerful and rich tool that enables us to address operational excellence in really good and creative ways. I think a thing that is emerging is the extending of this learning provision to other people, not simply employees or not simply students, but we talked about partners, subcontractors, and clients. In other words, something which is of benefit to one group may be of benefit to other people. In the airport services training we have been providing now over the last number of years for close on 100,000 courses, we have found many people, subcontractors, saying, this seems to have been a really relevant course. Would it be possible to do it for our staff? And issues like security, issues like ethical behavior, issues like customer service. And very often this enables the company which is engaged in training or the school to become a resource for other learning organizations. And to me, much of the future will be shaped by the dialogue and interaction between these very disparate groups in very, very creative ways. This extended learning provision transfers over into a program of access, increased access to continuous learning opportunities, additional resources. What do we need? I've very often been involved at policy level and also at consultancy level when people say, well, is this worth it? And I say, well, what is of value to you? What do you need? But there are resources frequently out there. And at the moment, we have never had, maybe it's as a result of the COVID rebuilding, but in Europe, we now have the largest single applied research program in the world. And we have billions of euro allocated to innovation, to creativity, to new programs, to new ideas, where we're asking people to become involved, come up with things. The European Union will fund it. And we hope that from that huge activity, we'll be able to say resources are available. Whatever your problem is, that's not one of them. Getting that message out at times is difficult. People say it's too costly. You remove it by saying we'll pay for it. It's not just the money. It's the original thinking, and it's the need for organizations, and dare I say it, many schools, to simply let go. We need to have empowered and trusted staff who become learning managers for themselves and for their students or their learners. And that means engaging employees in this final way in the development of learning programs. What is relevant to you? What worked best? What is the stuff that will stay with you? What do you remember and stays with you in terms of your development as a professional, as a competent individual, where quality is your second name? And this creates a real energy in any organization. We've had some disturbing evidence, if I can switch over to the educational sector for the moment. Because I teach with a university in Barcelona, I have lived for the last number of years in Spain, although I am Irish, but I work and travel all over the place. And there have been some very disturbing trends in Spanish formal education. And it is broken up because some of this is done by regional governments as well. But what I'm talking about is the question of teacher burnout. When people are forced to work in a rather rigid system and they have to perform on that level, they need to feel freshness. They need to feel creativity, not just being asked to do things because it's in the curriculum. And you learn to get ahead by memorizing that curriculum. And what's really important is that we begin to notice, and this was borne out by evidence in Ireland as well, that after 10 years, many teachers were burnt out, were not motivated. They simply did what they had to do to fulfill the requirements of the job. All I can say is, how destructive is this of an individual teacher? And how more destructive is this for the pupils who have to endure it? And this is not a criticism, but this is simply pointing a light on some of the structural impediments we have to really engaged and motivated learning. If teachers, if employees can be involved themselves in the development of learning, can master this and can see it as a tool for them and for others, ultimately their customers or ultimately their students, this is a wonderful win-win situation. And the final point that came out of all the work we've done on this was to provide inquiry-based opportunities for learning and development on a day-to-day basis. Now, clearly this implies a need for resources, for a think tank, for a body of people who are able to provide expertise and guidance. And this, fortunately, is somewhat available at some levels in Europe at the moment, but in terms of the various 27 member states, it varies from place to place and time to time. But I hope this gives you a flavor of what we're trying to do in terms of the digital learning programs in general, micro-modules in particular, in terms of creating added value and excellence. Here again are some of the comments that came through from research that's been done. Micro-learning modules, in the context I've already talked about, are extremely useful in giving workers easy to digest topic skills that they can immediately apply and change behaviors. How rich is this? You don't have to wait weeks or months to do something. You do it there. And second of all, that we're not just talking about changing understanding or knowledge, but talking about changing behavior. I was doing it this way. Now I can do it this way. I have seen many wonderful examples, and if we have time, I can give you examples of this, how this can happen. From using a telephone, communication skills, simple micro-learning modules that enable people to do something and then to retain that as a continuous part of their behavior in future, sustained way. This is wonderful change. 50% more engagement, Westfall said in 2016, we saw that referenced earlier, than traditional online training programs. Now, not on their own, I said it with it, but within a program. This is an extremely useful tool. Learning for the workplace, okay, design the context of actual workplace problems. So we don't do this in theoretical cyberspace, but we do it in real time based on people's real experience. And finding that the simulated environment can be highly enriching. Okay, so I'll just go back for a second, and engaging for students. So simulation, creating those environments, becomes a real laboratory of best practice and experimentation. One of the big things we have with our learners, whether in the corporate sector or in schools, is that to make a mistake is not wrong. It's how we learn. It is very hard to get that point through to people who are enmeshed in traditional learning systems. So finally, with the learning design element, the micro modules that we use, it comes down to two key things. The first thing is to attract. This is in terms of the practical work we're doing. How do we present it? We're trying to attract, in many of them, in organizations we work with, we're trying to bring good creative people into the organization by training them about the organization, let them see, let them experiment, let them decide if this is the place for them. This is staff recruitment. Okay, but we want to present a realistic picture about the employer and the work opportunities available. But the second thing is to engage, to trigger the interest and motivation of new employees or potential new ones. Large organization, very concerned about staff turnover, very, very worried about retention, and they wanted to see, could they use micro-learning, micro-modularity as part of the training program to be able to recruit the right people for the work they did. And you will see, again, this was designed by my colleague Demo Batla 3 years ago. It's been a highly successful case because it takes us away from simply this discussion about training to do a job or training and learning education in an educational schooling system to hear something about recruiting people. How do we use training before we even employ people? But we use it for a shared learning voyage, talent acquisition, a funnel, trying to find people who really want to work here. By training them, enable them to show that problem solving is part of their contribution to being selected. So you'll see that issues around introduction, attracting, assessing, engagement, this is go, moving into the area. If any of those areas becomes a block, then we can say, no, we won't go there. This shows the person is not suited for the job. The company presentation is done through micro-learning, the applicant introduction, the initial learning through micro-learning, and the suitability assessment combined with other forms. These are the practical tools here on the right. You will see from that, we then come into the application, the training program, the approval, the training planning, the dialogue between the candidate and the employer, working out a real engagement of what they want to do in terms of coming into a job, the training, the kind of work they will be doing, and finally being employed to do that job. This structured training process has produced very, very dramatic results in terms of employee satisfaction. And this is before people start. Even for people who decide it's not the job for them, come out with an enhanced view of the organization with a greater level of personal awareness about what they want to do in future. And you'll see that reflected on the right-hand side when we talk about commitment and motivation, how people handle issues like their personal information, educational training record, their work history, or their individual training plan. So you'll see a lot of the elements that go into this particular case study that also lead at the end, if the person does stay with the enterprise, what their recurrent training will be, their continuing education. Now, going back to some of the comments you made earlier in terms of, well, this is enterprise, what about the world of education? Wouldn't this be good if we were able to be clear with our students coming in about selecting for the right courses to do, rather than just have linear progressions from primary to secondary to university, but really looking at different stages of life, how students can go back and forward. One of the key initiatives of the Obama administration in the United States from 2008 to 2016 was the rediscovery of the importance of vocational education, and which in the United States barely exists anymore, was deconstructed. It's still very, very strong in Europe, particularly in Germany, for example. And there was the idea of bringing this back and enabling students, rather than having to fit into something they weren't happy with, but to fit into educational environments that met their needs. And a training program like this enables that selection and decision process to be done using micromodules in a productive and positive way that produces benefits for all people. I feel we may come back to this in the question and answer session we'll have towards the end of the workshop. Let me just go on to look at some of the other points here. This is just coming back to that slide. This is the service we used. We had over 17,000 candidates visiting this training program. 30% took the suitability assessment. From that, 15% applied for the open position. The number of applicants over 12 months' time increased by over 100%. We were able to manage a higher volume of applicants with less resources. And the critical outcome was that for those candidates who were selected, indeed the quality and suitability had improved significantly. I think this is quite a clear indication of understanding how training, how digital learning systems, and how micro modules with a clear focus and purpose can produce the results we want in guided time. So what are the general conclusions we've kind of drawn from this? Okay. And again, this is not designed to be written in stone. And I'd be delighted if you can accept or challenge or totally criticize this, but this is from our experience. Micromodularity, first of all, is a extremely important design principle, and it can improve the way courses are designed. And there's no doubt that's proven. But the real value is in proper learning design as a whole, which is about much more than just micromodularity. So it's become very important for us. Yes, these are great tools, but without an overarching learning design paradigm, they will not produce the excellent results we expect. Understanding the core principles of learning design in general will help us understand why micromodularity is important and how it can help that overall design and produce results that are positive and in focused ways. Concrete benefits are we establish clear, logical content structures, easy to understand and perceive by learners. We create learning programs that are easy to update, to localize and further develop into something different than the original purpose. And it helps us to split courses into digestible pieces, which can also work independently, even at topic level. Even a small course can have micro elements, for example. And here are some of the things I want to move on to our discussion now as we come towards the end of the workshop, but this comes from a recent program we have done, a micromodularity, which we did in Palestine with our project, where we said over recent years, micromodularity has emerged as a key design principle. The benefits adds flexibility, makes it possible to use the same learning resources in various ways, both independently and part of larger programs. Micro-modular learning can be used to provide more targeted learning interventions. It can be made accessible on demand, producing better engagement with the learning task. And some modern digital learning content development tools provide ready-made templates and structures for micro-modular design, making it easy to implement micro-modular courses. Now, I have case studies here, which I can mention very, very briefly. I think we may come back to those in discussion. But just to let you know that these are not simply things that have not been tried and tested, and these are things which are current. One has been in Scotland with a large public health provider with 200,000 employees, quite a lot in a country of just 6 million people. But we found that this was covering public health provision in people's homes. And we had care workers going into those homes and providing services. But we had no training program for these people. So we began to develop real on-time micro modules that could be linked up through a mobile telephone in the home using micro modules for staff training, but also improving performance for customers. This was a very large program which lasted over 4 years. It's being evaluated now, but it's made a huge difference to staff and indeed, if I can call them, to customers, to people in their homes. In Ireland, a niche telecom engineering company in the southeast providing very advanced technology began to use micro-learning modules to train its staff, who were very often deployed in consultancy projects for problem solving, and this has produced, again, very strong performance improvements that we've been able to record. Another one in Ireland was the development of a network of small and medium enterprises in the southeast. I've reflected some of the agencies we worked with on that, and this network was looking at best practice. And one of the things that's important, it's not just about production. When we think about industry, we think of that, but also about customer service, engaging with our customers, engaging with our wider constituency. And the micro modules we developed for that were extremely successful. In the United States, working in the Chicago area with an urban training and support agency, again in staff training and development. And finally, in Finland, these are the 5 case studies which I could go into in much more detail, but they're quite varied in terms of using a learning design approach with micro modules to address specific needs in particular countries and particular circumstances. And that technical sanitation maintenance company produced dramatic results for people, relatively low skills, but were able to enhance them through a targeted program of learning improvement and skill development. So finally, let's sum up some of the key points from all this. I kept talking about engaging interest. I keep talking about it because it's been critical to my experience and to the work we've done. That, sorry, I need to go back. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way. The deep impact of traditional learning systems is still with us. And it touches everything we do. The old ideas of memorization, of examinations which ask us to recall the memorized material, information gathering and systemization. And there's always a role for all these things, but it colors our ability to think in new ways about the future. Alternatives are possible. In fact, I would go further. Alternatives are required if we are to face the challenges of the world we're living in now. We need, through our training and training design and engaging the interest of our constituents, be they students or employees, to demonstrate good practice and to show in concrete terms that innovation works and produces sustainable benefits for them. It's a good idea with any of this to start with the greatest potential for immediate results exists. This is where we're at. This is what we need to do. This is our problem. Let's solve it. And we establish a positive flow of actions that motivate and commit stakeholders. All the way through, this is a process of our learning design of fostering managed change and looking at new thinking concepts and processes, not simply because they're new and different, but because in our judgment, in our critical ability to skim through and evaluate, okay, we come up with really valid, sustainable innovation. But new thinking ideas, concepts, and processes are critical, and that will inspire our learning content. That is the basis for our future development. Sustaining interest, deep impact. Traditional learning systems, indicating alternatives are possible, showing that innovation works. Okay? And it brings us to micro-modularity. Okay? Digital is not either or. Blended solutions are possible, very often required. The question of micro-modularity in content means that integration in the company's specific mission and the product is indeed optimized. Critical advantage is being able to update, the ease of access, flexibility, intimacy. These things sell themselves. Adding value at each stage enhances company growth, or indeed, I would say, school performance and school growth. From the work we have done, we've been able to develop online self-study modules, somewhat larger, maybe more rich in content or for people who want to go further, but an integrated part of each product. And finally, the question of external linkage we just touched on briefly when we talk about certification is something we need to look at. It's not essential, but to me it is advantageous, and it extends the work that we're doing in new and creative ways. So probably this is a good time to stop and ask our second question, or even to go into a good discussion, a roundtable discussion about some of the issues raised in terms of the presentation so far. And I would ask you, therefore, if this makes sense, how do you feel we best engage learners using this technology? And more importantly, how do we retain them? And while you are thinking about those questions, I will open up the questions and answers and see which other things you've come up with for me. And Saeed, you may want to bring more people into this discussion as well.
We've received a few questions. Should you want to answer them?
Yes, I was just looking here if I could before you give these to me. Bushra Al-Qatani again said, how do I know if the change is a result of the training I provide or because change is happening anyway? It's a wonderful question. And the answer is you don't. It's a combination of both. And the critical thing here, yes, change is happening anyway. And that's a given, but change will also result the training. The question is not, would your training produce change? It will, but will it produce the kind of qualitative change that's required? But there is an integrated symbiotic relationship between the two. And I think it's really good to always keep your eye on the fact that that change is occurring externally and indeed internally, but more importantly, that the training you provide is going to facilitate that and take it maybe in unusual ways. It's a great question, though.
We've also received a good question. It says that, could you recommend any resources that could help on designing micro-learning modules, especially for kids in schools?
I'm sorry, Zaid, could you say that again? I didn't quite pick that up.
It says, could you recommend any resources that could help on designing micro-learning modules, especially for kids in schools?
Yes, absolutely. I don't know if we're going to have the time to do it now. Part of the difficulty with the schools, and I'd like to explain something which is, I think, quite interesting. When we go to, I want to be careful with the terminology I use. I was going to say traditional schools, but I'm going to say mainstream schools. Very often these are under the auspices of a Ministry of Education. There is a set curriculum, and there are perfectly good reasons for this. ministries of education try to set standards, try to avoid deviations from what people need, try to ensure that there are standards and things that make sense for teachers and pupils alike. But they are very rigorous and very reluctant to let in new forms of training or external sources. So the experimentation around the need for these kind of micro modules in school settings is very often done in what are called, in Europe anyway, special schools. These are schools designed for people, for example, with disabilities or particular impairments. There is a very rich network, for example, of schools for the deaf and schools for the blind. And if our participants today have not looked at this, I can assure you that some of the greatest innovation in the world taking place at the moment is happening in these special schools. Because these are schools which are up against a huge amount of barriers for their pupils because of traditional prejudices, but also the difficulties of understanding how can children with these particular problems fit into the world in the longer term. And of course they can, but these schools very often have the freedom to experiment in new and creative ways. I can give a lot of resources on that, not so much on mainstream schools, although there are possibilities. There's a very good Centre for Curriculum Development Design in Ireland, for example, which produces wonderful research and informs the Department of Education about these developments, and the department will take them on board, will run pilot programs, will assess them, and then feedback. There are some great teacher networks. I'm just talking about Ireland now, which have been very, very rich in this. Other countries, France would be more traditional in terms of centralized control. Spain, I've already talked about some of my concerns. Finland, of course, is absolutely open to all these things, and you see a huge amount of stuff. What I can do is I would rather give indicators or give resources or materials that will be relevant to the questioners, okay? And maybe it would be good after this for me to do a list of potential resources that could be used, rather than trying to cover it here now. I am speaking from a European perspective with 27 different countries, some of them very different levels of development, but what I can get, I will be more than happy to share with anybody who wants it. And I hope that answers that question.
See.
Can I refer to a question that has come up on the discussion here?
Sure, please do.
Najat Al-Hamadi points out that I raised an important issue for teachers, new system grade goals back from creativity. And I think this is a wonderful observation. And if I take what Najat is saying, this is not just being critical, but this is saying that, look at the word that's used, we are stuck in the way because of a system. We are all stuck in this. And very often we don't move from that because we don't see an alternative. And I think what we need to say is that this is very, very important. I think, allow me to digress. In Western thought, there's a very, very negative tradition of dualism. It's either this or that, black or white, yes or no. And it doesn't mean that everything that has gone before this is wrong and everything that's new is good. That's far from the case. There are many things in traditional systems which are wonderful and which are good, and which have gone through the test of time. But a system which becomes fossilized around one particular area constricts everybody. So we need to be, and I love this, what Najat says, how are we being held back from creativity? How do we go there that the creativity is not threatening to educational stakeholders, but produces real benefits for everybody? And I think we need to have space to experiment and to go into those things. And that to me is where so many tools like modularity, for example, and all these useful lie. And I think that's really important. And I hope that answers not just a wonderful observation, okay?
Another question, it says, is it better to focus on developing skills than to gain grades?
Better to develop skills as opposed to the last phrase, sorry?
It says, is it better to focus on developing skills than to gain grades?
Why not both? Why not both? And I think I'm going back to my, either or is really both and. To me, skill acquisition is at the core of what we do as educators. Okay, it's about skills, but also be able to gain things that increase our skill, our adaptability, our contribution to society, I think is a really critical dimension. And the interesting thing, Zaid, is that the technology we have now allows us to do that. For the first time in human history, we have a tool. We have a tool which is instantaneous, which is international, which is communicative, which enables us to really move into a digital universe. I'm not into a metaverse parallel reality idea at all. I'm into this world and to the real needs we have in this world. And let's tap that creativity and let's try and use this in real ways. So let's gain those skills. Let's gain those kind of ideas, which I think is really important. And I think the digital resources give us that to be able to answer both and. There is a comment as I'm replying to you that I noticed on our forum from, I hope I pronounced this correctly, Bogus, okay, which is quite an extended comment, okay, that talks about many institutes, instead of focusing on achieving these important competencies, focus on just getting accreditation. And I think this is a risk. Bogus goes on to say, digital learning is, without doubt, an excellent tool for those who would really like to learn for the sole goal of improving their competence. I would love to quote this again. That's a beautiful sentence. Imagine if you have a student who says, I just want to learn so I can improve my competence. I know any of us who's a teacher and educator will go a very long way for that person. Yes, that's what digital learning gives us. But digital learning must be based on digital design. And that digital design must be based on the primacy of human needs, human development needs. And this takes me into other areas like sustainable development goals and human rights indexes and the idea of participatory and engaged education, which has been at the core of so much of the work I've done through special education systems and many, many other environments. Okay, I can see lots of other comments here. Can I mention just one point here? Mohammed Nashat asked a very, very interesting question about, do we always have to have a human presence in micro-learning videos? Is that a must? Or can we do all of ours based on screen recording, text, motion, animation, and narration? I think any creative system can work. We have used sometimes human systems, depending on the subject, can be very useful. Other times, good animation or even little figurines, human-like figurines that talk. I think it must be engaging from the get-go. We can't have a delay in this. We must bring people into it. And I think how we design that, make it attractive, is a lovely overplay between digital technology and between arts, which I think is good. There's a final point that Mohammed makes. Do you think synchronous meeting is important in training programs? Absolutely. I love the idea of distance learning. I love the idea of us doing things remotely and in different forms of capacity, but there's still something wonderful and enriching about human beings meeting each other, breathing the same air. And this is something which I think COVID has probably taught us in great detail, which is important for us now. Now, I noticed that there are other comments. There are also people giving me their email addresses and everything, all of which I am absolutely happy to do. I am also aware, Zaid, that we have about 5 minutes left, and I won't be able to answer all those now, but I hope after this presentation, I will, and maybe Zaid, with your help in the NELC, get back to the questions I haven't been able to answer specifically right now. Is that acceptable to you?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, so let me see. I think I have a couple of other final comments just to make on the slides. Quick tips: using micromodules, short chunks, video, no repetition, visually rich, and use storytelling. And finally, for learning design in general, I cannot say this enough. We need strategic vision. Digital training resources enable and empower SMEs and indeed schools and teachers. Cost benefit is always brought in and it's important, but more important is added value. What we do in learning design is a gateway to innovation and improved employee satisfaction buy-in. I've stressed over and over the importance of constant change and dynamism of methods and contents. This is not a system designed for static companies or schools, but linked to planned growth strategies. And the centrality here is constant communications, adaptability, and trust. And I think that would be a core element in what, sorry, I don't know what's going on here, in what we need to do. And that's my final slide, Zaid. Thank you very much. My email is there. If anybody wants to contact me anytime, day or night, I'm always available. And I would love to carry on this dialogue with any of those of you who would like to continue this as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bruce. We would like to remind our participants to complete the survey via the link provided in the chat. NELC will send the certificates to all participants by email within 5 working days. On behalf of the National eLearning Center and the International Conference, eLearning for Human Capability Development, we thank our distinguished speaker, Dr. Alan Bruce, CEO and Director of Universal Learning Systems, for this productive workshop. We would also like to thank our participants for being interactive during this session. We hope this workshop is of value to all of us. Once again, my name is Zaid Al-Ragab, the moderator for this session. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.